Well, good morning, Bright City Church. How is everyone?
I think we're going to start opening these seats up.
I know, it's a little bit full. It's a good problem to have, but for those of you who have been a part of our church for a while, you know that we set aside Lent as a time to pray and fast about a permanent location, and mornings like this really motivate us. So we're in the home stretch of praying for a location, and so if you haven't been doing that, we would really love for you to join us in that. But if you are new, welcome. My name is Sharon. This is Ike. We are two of the pastors here at Bright City Church, and we would love to connect with you. This is actually a great Sunday to be here if you are new, because once a month we do something called Pizza with the Pastor right after the second service. And so that is happening today, immediately after the service. If you are new, you can join us, walk right down to California Pizza Kitchen, and we will have lunch with people who are new. We have a number of people who have already RSVP'd, but if you would like to join us, if you just showed up and this is the first time you're hearing about it, you can still join us as well. There is a QR code on the card, and there should be one on the screen as well. If you scan that code, you can actually RSVP, let us know you're coming so we can go ahead and order enough pizza. But if you're not ready for that, that's totally fine as well. We would still love to just know that you're here and follow up with you. You can either fill out that card and hand it to someone with a black shirt, or there's a link with that QR code that says new here. Just click on that and follow up as well. You'll also notice with that QR code, there is a link to give. Giving, the way we talk about giving is it's not an announcement, it is an act of worship. It's how we tangibly demonstrate the priority of God in our lives. And so you can give through that link, or you can set up automatic monthly giving through brightcitychurch.com/give. So the major event coming up is that this is Holy Week. We are kicking off Holy Week. Today is Palm Sunday, and if you've been out of church for a while, maybe that phrase Palm Sunday is a little unfamiliar, but that's when we remember Jesus's triumphal entry, and it's kind of the beginning of his final days, and it all culminates with Good Friday, where we will remember Jesus's death. And as a church, we will be observing Good Friday with an online service. It'll be Friday evening. You can just go to brightcitychurch.live, I believe. And then we will have a sunrise service Sunday morning at the farm for anyone who would like to join that. And all this information is on our website and the emails. And then finally, we will have our main Easter service will be Sunday morning at 10:30 at Old Mill Farm. And we're so excited. There will be a lot more space there. It's light. You can see everyone. We can worship and celebrate the resurrection together. And then immediately after that, we will have lunch. And so if you would like to join us for lunch, if you can go ahead and let us know, RSVP, and pay for your lunch. And one thing I would really invite you to do, if you would like to bring friends, I would invite you to not just invite them to come, but maybe to pay for their lunch as well. I think that would be a really wonderful way for people to come and experience Bright City for the first time. But this will be a great Sunday to invite people for the first time. And then after the service, we'll have lunch, and then we'll also have an Easter egg hunt. So all of that is coming up. We are very, very excited and can't wait to see you there. And then this morning, we have kind of a special morning. Our bumper video was kind of a fake out. We are in the middle of our first email series, but we're doing something a little bit different this morning. We have a guest speaker, and so Ike is going to introduce him.
So before I do that, I did want to say today is the deadline for getting your food, for paying for your food for Easter lunch. So go ahead and take care of that this morning. But yes, we have a very special guest joining us this morning. I'm not even sure, I was telling Sharon earlier, I'm not even sure how we originally got connected, but I'm pretty sure it was one of those situations where Sharon kept saying, you've got to read this book, you've got to read this book, you've got to read this book. And finally I was like, okay, I'm going to read this book. And as I got into it, it's a book called Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs. And the book just came out at an incredible time, just the timing of it. We were heading into the pandemic and just realizing how much anxiety was in our world, the anxiety around the pandemic and around racial tension and political tension. And this book just came in at such an incredible time to be able to identify and name what were the dynamics at work in our world and how do we as leaders and pastors navigate that well and faithfully. And so this has been a gift to us during this season. Steve has really pastored us from a distance online and through podcasts. And Steve has been the pastor of Discovery Christian Church in Colorado. He comes to us by way of Colorado from Australia. So a wonderful accent to listen to this morning, but now runs an organization called Capable Life, and it's just a tremendous online gift and platform for managing anxiety in relationships in different contexts, in our work relationships, in our marriages. And so just so thankful to have him this morning. He generously let us know that he was going to be in the area, and so is swinging by to preach this morning. So if you could join me in welcoming Steve Cuss. His book will be available for sale after the service. If you'd like to pick up a copy, I really encourage it. So thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. I think most of us, I'm just going to get right in. I think most of us experience a gap between what we believe about God and what we experience from God. And I think in many ways, whether you're a follower of Christ or not, this is the gap that means to be human. This is the gap we grapple with. I think there are three main gaps. For example, in my life, I believe God loves me, but I don't always feel it. I believe God's with me, but I don't always see it. And the third gap is I just thought I'd be further along in my faith by now. I was not raised in the church. I came to Christ as a teenager. But still, I've put about 3.5 decades into following Jesus. I just thought I would be better at it by now than I am. I thought I'd be further along. But out of those three gaps, the one that has really persisted the deepest in my life is the idea that what God teaches and what the Bible clearly teaches is God loves me in a very particular way, but I struggle to experience that. If you rummage around in my belief systems, what you find very quickly is that I tend to believe, or my default belief, is that God loves me in a very generic way. There's billions of people on this planet, and like in the show Les Miserables, I'm prisoner 24601. I'm just another number that God loves, and I experience a gap between the thing that I bet my life on, which is that the center of the universe is love, that God's very heartbeat is love, between that and what I actually encounter on a regular basis. This started for me when I served as a trauma chaplain. I was a Christian for, 3 or 4 years, and then I went off to Bible college. Oddly enough, that's when I moved to America from the beach of Perth, Western Australia, and to the Appalachian region of Knoxville, Tennessee. Just a slight cultural difference. As my chaplain supervisor told me in Tennessee, there's more Baptists than people in Tennessee. I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, but at the same time, I know exactly what he meant by that. And so I graduated from Bible college, this guy that was fairly young in my faith. I had a Bible degree, and next thing I know, I'm a trauma chaplain and I'm a hospice chaplain at 24 years of age. And I'd never seen a dead body before then, and I'd never had any personal experience of grief before then. And here I was, and the job completely took me off my feet and took my breath away, because a lot of what happened, sometimes dozens of times a day, is people begging me to beg God for a miracle. And my own faith was young, and it was fairly certain, both because of my own human development, but also how long I'd been a Christian. Things were very black and white for me. I was also an entrepreneurial type A, get-it-done kind of guy. And it turns out that none of those skills are helpful in chaplaincy. In fact, they all get in the way. And that the skill of chaplaincy is actually more about restraint than activity. That you have to restrain the impulse to do something and say something if you really want to be effective. And so here are these people. Sometimes I remember somebody would grab me by the shoulders and scream at the top of their lungs, how could God allow this to happen? And so there I am dozens of times a day, people begging me to beg God for a miracle. And in case you're wondering, I have no problem that people beg God for miracles, maybe even right now. You are carrying something, or maybe you have a loved one who particularly maybe has a medical condition, and you're begging God. You're like, God, only you can heal this. I have no problem with that. I don't think the problem is that we beg God for miracles. I don't think God has a problem. In fact, I think God welcomes those kinds of prayers. I think the problem is that we all don't want one miracle. We all want one more miracle. We all just want one more miracle than we have. And what happened in my young faith is when my job was to ask God for healing, the simple fact is the percentages weren't great. That more often than not, people died than were miraculously healed. And I couldn't name this at the time, but I'm a chronic people pleaser. I like to make people happy. And again, I couldn't name this at the time either, but when I was praying, it's almost like I was taking responsibility for whether the person would be healed or not. And so after a while, I started to build like a Teflon layer around my heart. That if I don't ever expect anything out of God, then God can't let me down. I remember in the 1980s, there was a Christian singer, a Christian punk singer, by the way. This is before all Christian music was worship music. There was actually diversity in our Christian music back then. And there was this punk singer named Steve Taylor. Maybe some of you have heard of Steve Taylor or listened to Steve Taylor. All I can tell you is if you like Steve Taylor, we're already friends. We don't even know each other. We're already friends. And Steve Taylor had this song, "Since I Gave Up Hope, I Feel Much Better." And you really can't experience the particular love of God when you've built Teflon around your heart, guarding what gets in. When I was a chaplain, I was introduced to this thing called systems theory. It's what my book is about. You can Google systems theory, there's all kinds of resources, but basically it studies a particular kind of anxiety. And not only does it study this particular anxiety, but it watches how this kind of anxiety spreads. First in me, and then you learn, once you've noticed how anxiety spreads in yourself, then you learn how to notice in any room or any environment. Like I can kind of be a bummer at parties because I can figure out, those of you who are married, I can usually figure out your marriage dynamic in about a minute, maybe 90 seconds. It was very helpful as a chaplain to be able to walk into a room where there's a family and to very quickly notice the family dynamic. Like back then, I'm pretty rusty now, but back then I could generally dictate birth order with about a 70 to 80% accuracy, just based on the way people related. Who's the black sheep? Who's the one that never speaks up, but when they speak, they veto the vote of the other siblings? All of these dynamics. This is systems theory, the study of anxiety, but it's a particular kind of anxiety. Anxiety, in today's word, it's a big word, it's a broad word, it covers all this territory. You have trauma, for example, you have grief. Those are different anxieties that manifest differently. You have acute anxiety, like when your kid is missing from the playground and suddenly you stop everything. It's life and death. That's acute anxiety. You have anxiety that is only served best by psychiatric medicine. Those are all different kinds of anxiety than the anxiety that I was trained in. I was trained in what's called chronic anxiety. And I'll explain it for you, but I just want to have a word because I am a pastor, that the kind of anxiety that requires psychiatric medicine, it's just important for me that you hear from me that I believe psychiatric medicine is a gift from God. And that if you have a psychiatrist or a doctor that has helped you because you are taking pills to manage your life, I think that is a gift from God. I think it is no comment on your faith or your spiritual maturity. In fact, many people I know who are on psychiatric medicine have a phenomenal faith, have a true depth of spiritual maturity. But the kind of anxiety that I was trained in, systems theory, it's called chronic anxiety, and it operates differently than all the other anxieties. Because it's based on assumptions, false expectations, and false beliefs. And every one of us in this room, we hold assumptions about ourselves. We hold assumptions about how we should treat each other, how you should treat me, and we hold assumptions about how you should treat each other. Assumptions, expectations, and false beliefs. So some of you right now, you're saying, oh, I can recline my movie theater seat and I can kind of check out of the sermon because I'm not really an anxious person. Chronic anxiety, it's not so much about worry and fear. That's acute anxiety. Chronic anxiety is better understood as reactivity. You know when the cell phone company didn't give you the credit they said they would give you, and you call and you have to navigate the robot to get to the human, and then you get put on hold and it's an hour and you get frustrated. That's chronic anxiety because it's generated by your assumptions and expectations about how people should treat each other and how you should be treated. Chronic anxiety is fascinating. It's the only form of anxiety that's contagious. We catch it from each other. Those of you who are married, or those of you who have kids, or those of you who were a kid once, you know what it's like to catch anxiety from another person in your household. You know, a couple of years ago, we all went into lockdown for COVID, but no one told us that not only are we trying to stop the spread of COVID, we're also trying to stop the spread of reactivity in our households. Chronic anxiety, assumptions, false beliefs, they're generally generated by 5 core false needs of every human being. Now, we don't all have these 5 core false needs, but all of us have some of these, and here they are. Control, perfection, always knowing the answer, always being there for people, and people's approval. Now, you probably don't have all 5. I don't have all 5. For me, it's the back 3. But for some of you in this room, you're just, let's face it, you're just a control freak. The best thing you could do in your life is volunteer with the toddlers. Toddlers are a gift from God for control freaks. Now, some of you are perfectionists. You believe the lie that you must get it perfectly right every time, even though you've never done it before. Whatever it is, perfection is the standard. There's always the carrot out of reach. You can always tell a perfectionist because when you compliment a perfectionist, they'll often correct you. Or if they don't correct you, maybe they're too courteous, they'll disagree with you in their heart. And Jesus says it's the same thing, perfectionist. So no difference, just because in your heart you're saying, oh no, I could have done it better. Some of us, I'm one of these people, we always have to have the answer. Just last Sunday I was at church and Brendan, who's on our staff, he runs our coffee shop at our staff, and Avery came to him and she gave him a little shot of espresso. They're trying out a new coffee machine. And she said, what do you think, Brendan? There's something wrong with it. And I'm a pastor. I'm not the guy running the coffee, but I'm standing next to Brendan and I found myself interrupting because I have to have the answer. When somebody asks someone else the question, my reactive impulse is to answer it. Why is that? What is that? It's because I spent my whole childhood feeling stupid. I just always saw myself as the stupid kid, and I love the feeling of knowing. It covers my shame quite nicely. Always being there for people. Some of you incessantly, if somebody somewhere is hurting, you say to yourself, self, I must bake a lasagna. I must stop what I'm doing. I must bake a lasagna. And you show up to that person's house, you have the lasagna, and the person's like, look, I'm lactose intolerant, but thanks, I guess. And you know, you think it's because God told you to be there for others, but it's actually because you need to be needed. You have this chronic, unending need to be needed, to be useful. And you spend time alone at night sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you're like, well, who's there for me? And you don't realize that you pushed your friends away because you've never asked them for help. They call and they say, how can I help? You say, I'm fine. You see yourself as, I'm there for others. I'm not somebody who's in need. It's very difficult to be loved by God when you're self-sufficient. And then, of course, those of us with approval, I'm the back 3 of these 5. I'm like a golden retriever. Like if I've disappointed you or if you're angry at me, it takes work for me because anxiety spreads. You have violated my assumptions that I must make you happy. It's pretty rough as a pastor, I got to say. I learned some hard early lessons pastoring people where, you know, if there's 100 people in the church, that means there's about 235 opinions, something like that, last time I did the math. And there's something weird about church that when you attend it after a while, you think you know how to run it. Even though you've not had any training and you happily tell the pastor what you should do, well, that's fine, but if the pastor's a people pleaser, I'll just scurry around trying to make everyone happy. As I as I jumped into this field of chronic anxiety, systems theory, I started to see the problem with the gap I was facing between the love of God I so profoundly teach others and the love I was struggling to experience myself, and it was based on my false beliefs. My false beliefs. Like, I believe that Jesus is love, but under that belief there is a counter belief or a false belief, or if you will, there was a gospel. Gospel, it's a church word, right? Like, those of you who are not church people, and maybe you're here today and you're not in the habit of church, you're not sure what you think about churches and Jesus and everything. You hear that word gospel, you say, well, that's a church word. Actually, it's pretty wild, but gospel was a political word before it was ever a church word. And the first group to come up with the word gospel was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire. And it's no coincidence, I think, that here we are on Palm Sunday. This is a great day to notice the difference between the gospel of Jesus and every other gospel that you believe in. Because as a Christian, what's true about me is, yes, I believe in the gospel of Jesus. I have bet my life on that gospel. But yes, also, there are somewhere between 15 and 50 other gospels I believe that based on my assumptions and my false beliefs. And so Palm Sunday is a great day to notice it because Palm Sunday celebrates Jesus' triumphal procession. That's what it's called, Jesus' triumphal procession, when he gets on the foal of a donkey, this tiny creature, and he rides into Jerusalem. He processes into Jerusalem on this parade. People are putting their palms down. They're singing Hosanna. It's a great day. It's a big day in the life of God's people and in the life of Jesus. But what's interesting is Jesus is, in some ways, he's doing like a street theater stunt. I don't know that we talk about this enough in church, but Jesus was not just fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, but he was also like exposing the fraud of the Roman Empire gospel, because as Jesus is processing into Jerusalem from one side of town, Pontius Pilate is processing from his town in Caesarea Philippi where he lives. He's coming from the other direction, and he's also having a triumphal procession. Because in the Roman Empire, when some official showed up somewhere, they didn't just take an Uber and get out of the back seat of the car. They processed big time. So Pontius Pilate would have come on a giant horse, and the horse would have had all kinds of armor on it. But he also would have been surrounded by his minions and then centurions. And then sometimes, quite often in a Roman Empire procession, there'd be a couple of hundred slaves that they'd drag along at the back of the procession, kind of as a warning to the people that they were showing up. Hey, if you don't pay your taxes and live right, you'll be at the back of our procession. Like Pontius Pilate's procession, his triumphal procession, was this massive display of military power and might, and it was called the Peace of Rome. That was the name of the gospel that was going on in Jesus' day. The name of the gospel was the Peace of Rome. If you live this way, if you pay your taxes, if you sell us your children into slavery, if you let us conquer you and oppress you and treat you terribly, then maybe you'll get peace. Palm Sunday is a massive subversive contrast in the fundamental understanding of power. And what's interesting is Jesus is processing into Jerusalem, and in our churches and in the Bible, it kind of looks like it's this giant thing, but it actually didn't last very long, and it actually wasn't very big. Jesus didn't have minions. He had tax collectors and prostitutes and fishermen. He didn't even have the right people around him. He didn't have a big horse. He didn't even have a donkey. He had the foal of a donkey. It's meant to be funny, right? It's subversive and funny. Look, there's not much humor in the Bible. You kind of have to take it when you can get it. So Jesus is riding like a baby donkey. I want those of you who love your Westerns, those of you who love your battle scenes like Lord of the Rings, who saddles up your donkey to go to battle? What's going on here? And Jesus made such a huge impact with this that no one really noticed at all. This was not a threat to the Roman Empire, because Jesus had such little power in the way they understood power. It didn't even bother them. I want you to imagine, those of you who have kids, maybe you have a kindergartner in the house and your kindergartner brings over a friend. Let's call him Adam. And this little 5-year-old kid, Adam, he walks around, he comes into your house, he greets you, hi, and then he does his own tour of the house. He's looking around, he's checking out the kitchen, he's looking in the fridge, the pantry, and then he comes up to you and he says, one day all of this will be mine. You look at little Adam, you're like, go back and watch Caillou, little boy. He's got no power. He's not a threat. That's funny. That's kind of the way the Roman Empire saw Jesus. Even when they crucified him with stunning indifference because they didn't see him as a threat. That's because the Roman Empire only understood power one way. We use power to dominate, and we push down on top of people to oppress them and squeeze them down. Jesus uses power not to come above you, but to come underneath you. And his power doesn't push down, it sets free. And Rome couldn't recognize it. Jesus' power doesn't subjugate, it empowers. Jesus' power doesn't enslave, it turns you into his sister or brother. It's absolutely breathtaking, and Rome missed it. They didn't notice it because they didn't know how to notice true power. They only knew man-made power, which is temporal power. They did not know divine power. I got to share this. I love this. People are confused, how in the book of Acts did the church explode? How did so many people, thousands added to their numbers every day? What was that? There's a Harvard professor named Sarah Rudin. And she was a classics professor, or she is a classics professor. She specializes in literature from the Roman Empire. And also, she happens to be a Christian. And she's a feminist. Sarah Rudin is a feminist. And so she always avoided the Apostle Paul because she didn't like the way Paul talked about women in the Bible. And one day, I don't know, about 10 years ago, she wakes up and she says to herself, "Self, you're a Roman Empire classicist and you're a Christian. You really should take Paul," this is how she describes it, "unchain him from the backyard where you chained him up and really study Paul." And she studied Paul's command for women to wear a veil in the church. It's a very controversial command in the Bible that women, it feels very subjugating. And what Sarah Rudin discovered is in the Roman Empire, only a citizen of Rome gets to wear a veil. If you're a slave, if you're a prostitute, if you're a former slave, if you're a former prostitute, if you're low income, if you're a daily subsistence farmer, no veil for you. You do not get a veil in the Roman Empire. So it's very easy in the Roman Empire to see who has status and who's a nobody. Who do we honor and who do we exploit? And Sarah Rudin said, Paul was teaching in the church, everybody is somebody. You might be a slave out there, you might be exploited out there, but ma'am, when you come to church, you put that veil on because you are a daughter of the king in this place. Revolutionary, radical, no wonder this gospel that comes underneath, it was so explosive, no wonder it sets us free. What I started to notice in my own battle to experience the love of God is the gospel I was believing had more in common with the Roman Empire than it did with Jesus of Nazareth. You know, when we think of gospels, we think of that thing out there, right? Like the Roman gospel, the gospel of Jesus, the American dream, if you will, is a gospel. At the end of the day, all a gospel really is a path with a promise and a payment. Like do this thing to get this thing. And somebody along the way has to pay. So, for example, the American dream is a gospel. If you want this promise, you have to walk this path, and by golly, do you have to pay? And of course, as is often the case in most countries, in this country's history, sometimes others had to pay for you to get the promise. What's interesting about the gospel of Jesus, it's the only gospel where the God pays for the sake of the human rather than the other way around. Every other religion, even today's religions. My son is a student in college, and his roommate is Muslim, and right now it's Ramadan. And Bryson is very respectful of Saeed, who's praying 5 times a day. And they're having conversations about grace. And it's the simple question of who pays in this religion. And our family have tremendous respect for our Islam sisters and brothers, and there's many good teachings in Islam, that's true. But here's what's also true. Just like every other gospel before it, the human pays to appease the God. But in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the God pays to free the human. And so one of the things that you can do this week is you can simply ask yourself the question, well, what gospels am I believing? What path am I on? What promises am I trying to get? And then I think most powerfully, who's paying? For example, let's talk about the gospel of financial security. Every one of us in this room probably have a number in mind that helps us relax. How much money do you believe you have to have in the bank so you can relax? For years, my answer was just $10,000 more. Whatever the number was, it was just plus 10,000. It was dangling carrot out of reach. But that is a path and a promise and a payment. And what I'd like to do now is move us from those kind of gospels into the gospel that we tell ourselves, which is what's called in systems theory, the story we tell ourselves. The story we tell ourselves is how our chronic anxiety, how our assumptions and false beliefs are manifest in our thinking patterns. And one of the things I noticed about the story I told myself is it puts me on a path and it offers me a promise, but there's never a payoff. The path actually is like a wheel for a rat. So for example, chronic anxiety, when my assumptions are violated, where I have false beliefs and I get filled with chronic anxiety, what chronic anxiety tells me is a gospel. And it says, Steve, you need to worry more. You can worry your way to peace. And then the other thing I discovered is inside the story I tell myself, there's this little guy on my shoulder. He's colloquially known as the inner critic. And the inner critic in my mind has a gospel that it's constantly telling me about myself and about the way the world is. And what I was doing, I was not aware of this until several years ago, I was giving more horsepower to the voice of my inner critic than I was to the gospel of Jesus. I was letting my inner critic speak louder than the gospel of Jesus. Here's the gospel of Jesus. 1 John 3. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our hearts condemn us, we know that God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything. That's the gospel of Jesus. We can be, John says, in God's presence at rest. We can relax into the grace of God. We can relax in the presence of God, even when our hearts are condemning us. That's the inner critic. I was fly fishing several years ago. I live in Colorado, and I believe it's a sin to live in Colorado and not fly fish. I just think that's bad stewardship. So I took up fly fishing, and I love it. I love fly fishing, and I'm not very good at it. And several years ago, I'm in a stream, and fly fishing for me is a great act of worship. I'm in creation. I love it. And there's these trout, and they're feeding, and no matter what I throw at them, whatever fly, whatever depth, I cannot catch a trout, and everyone around me is catching trout. And there I am knee-deep in a trout stream as a fully grown man, and my inner critic is saying, see how stupid you are? You're so stupid you're not even smarter than a stupid fish. This thing, fly fishing, that's meant to be a gift from God, twisted, stolen and twisted by my inner critic. And what I've had to learn to do in my life is to no longer give my inner critic the last word. It's hard to do. Do you have an inner critic? That story that you tell yourself whenever you don't live up to your own standards? That story that's very quickly putting you into shame? Everyone has it. You can't really stop it from clocking in for work. What you can do is relegate it to the basement. I recognize in a room, there may be another person in this room that salutes the Queen like I do. Most of you are more about dumping tea in a harbor and shooting at redcoats and stuff like that. That's fine. I'm fine with that. You and I are fine with each other. But I'm a Queen saluter. The Queen of England is my sovereign. That may sound very funny to you, but the coin in my pocket has the Queen of England's head on it. She's my sovereign. And if she were to summon me to Buckingham Palace, I would have to go. It's not an option. And then when I'm there, there's rules, there's protocol. The Queen has the first word. You stand there and you wait until she speaks, and then you get to speak. She has the first word, and she has the last word. Can you imagine correcting the Queen? Can you imagine mansplaining to the Queen? And God is our sovereign, those of us who are followers of Christ. God is our sovereign. And of course, God is very different from a human sovereign, just the way Jesus is different than Pontius Pilate. Author of Hebrews says that we can enter God's presence anytime. We don't have to wait to be summoned. We just get to walk right in. We don't have to wait for God to speak. We can just blab our mouths like a kid visiting dad at the office. Open invitation, full access. But I think the problem is we've gotten way too comfortable talking back to God. God speaks, but we live like we know better than God does. That our view of ourselves is higher than God's view of us. David says in the Old Testament that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, that when we were being knit together in our mother's wombs, God knew our name. And we say, well, we could do to improve a bit. God says, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And we say, well, I'll just condemn myself. Jesus says that God knows you so intimately, he knows the very number of hairs on your head. And let's face it, for some of us in the room, that's easier for God than others. Like that God can estimate for some, but for some he can count one by one. But we say, no, God's too busy with other people. The same gospel in a different translation. This is the Message version. John says, this is the only way we'll know we're living truly, living in God's reality. It's also the way to shut down debilitating self-criticism, even when there's something to it. For God is greater than our worried hearts, and he knows more about us than we do ourselves. It's difficult, isn't it, to be loved by God? To stand there like a man, or a woman if you are one, in the wonderful words of Colin Hay. To stand there like a man or a woman and receive the love of God, no pretense, no Teflon over your heart, complete vulnerability, nothing to protect you from rejection and pain, but also no condemnation. What I noticed as I listened to the voice of my inner critic is it was more Roman Empire than Jesus. It was top-down power oppressing me and keeping me trapped. It was not bottom-up power that releases me to be free. The very thing that both of them are offering, freedom, peace, and love, only one of them was giving it, and that was the one paying. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to invite you to pray a prayer. What I do in my life is I pray this prayer, because what I'm talking about is easier to say than to do, is I try to get in the habit of letting my inner critic speak, but then after it's done speaking, I try to give God the last word. So I can, over time, live by faith about what God says about me over and above what I think about myself. And so this is the prayer. What if I were at least as blank to myself as God is? What if I were at least as kind to myself? What if I were at least as patient? What if I was as loving to myself or forgiving of myself as God is? I'm just going to invite you to take everything out of your hands and just have your hands in a receiving posture. It may feel weird to you, but you can put them on your lap or have them in the air. And I'm just going to give you a time of quiet where you can fill in the blank for yourself. What would it look like if you gave God the last word, the final say in who you are and what God sees? And what would your life look like if by faith you believed God over yourself? I'll just give you some time to quietly fill in the blank for yourself.